A warm welcome to everyone for our PC Quest 35 years journey from 1987 to 2022. Today we will be discussing taking computer education to the masses in the 20th century, the new millennium and the future. Basically, we're looking at the online education scene in India yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And for that, we have the perfect person with us, a giant in the form of Mr. R.S. Pawar, chairman and founder of NIIT, who was there from the very beginning and is still going strong today. Welcome, Mr. Pawar.
Thank you so much, Sunil. It's a pleasure to engage with a co-traveler, which is 6 years younger than us.
Yes, absolutely.
6-year-old when you arrived on the scene, but
yeah.
It's been a long journey together, and I have cherished every moment of it. So very happy to be.
Yeah. Now, as you said, it's great that we are going on a 35-year journey. We are talking someone whose journey is 40 years plus. So that's quite fascinating. Thank you for this. Yeah. So I'll just get straight to it. So as we discussed, NIIT was formed way back in 1981, even before the PC era began in India. So what was IT education like back in those days, and who availed it? So what is the legacy of the 70s that you carried on forward to the 1980s?
Well, at that time, it was non-existent, if I can use one word, building skills for the sector. But we expected the IT industry, the manufacturing industry at that time was already anticipating a problem of talent shortage. And we were all very concerned. I was myself involved in the computer industry. And this was the number one concern, that how will the industry grow? So NIIT was actually born out of that, the threat to the growth of the industry. It was a problem, and we saw that as an opportunity. So at that time, there were a handful of people coming out of the IITs, but they were not the ones who would be writing programs mostly. There would be few, and the numbers were very small. So it was very, very small. There were a few outfits here and there, but nothing significant to build talent for the sector, which many of us could see would be a really important thing to do. So basically, to your question, the answer is it was non-existent at that time.
That's quite interesting. So from a non-existent state in 1981, you are ready for the computer revolution which came later. So what was the effect of the new computer policy in 1984? And how did the PC democratize computer education from there on, and how?
So I think, all of us in the industry take great credit for doing everything that we did. But those of us who've lived here for many decades recognize the significance of the changing context and some incidents that happen, which are not our creation. So the fact that Rajiv Gandhi arrived on the scene was not of our creation. The fact that he had no experience of politics conventionally, but he'd been flying a plane, so he knew electronics, and he had a good friend and advisor in San Petroda. So that accident created a situation where there was a lot of attention being given to the future. And computers did at that time by then symbolize that the future is here. So among the first policies that came out was the policy. It was on software and talent, human resources, education and software. And so I think that it articulated the need very clearly, the magnitude of the need very clearly. It talked about the constraints, and the policy talked about saying that we better do something to do whatever it takes for India and Indian companies and the government to catch up with this new wave of computers. And the policy talked a lot about building talent.
Yeah, so I guess the stage is set. So after that, I would be curious to know what are the kind of courses that were on offer in the 1980s, and what was the impact of this training on the industry at that time?
So COBOL was that time state of the art. I mean, there were fourth generation languages coming, but we also taught Fortran to the few engineering people and the scientists. But basic language had arrived by then. From Dartmouth, it was becoming popular. And so the first two courses that NIIT announced in 81, and one was called Entry Level Basic. That means you know nothing. It was not basic, but basic as a language. Entry Level Basic. It was a 4-week program, 5 days a week, 2 hours a day. And then we had what we called a long-term program. that was entry-level COBOL, which was 12 weeks. It was long term in our mind. And so the early thrust was in languages, but very soon we were realizing that programming is one part of it. You need to do analysis. You need to define a problem. So systems analysis and design was the next. And then it went on quite quickly for us to realize that companies really wanted to build a strategy. So programmers have to program, managers have to allocate resources, buy the hardware and software, and the users have to define. So we spent a lot of time doing user education. And this was all attended by corporations, so they were public programs. Okay. Then there was a lot of demand on how to buy computers. So we ran a program called How to Buy a Computer. Not for the individuals, but for corporates which are trying to look at it. So there were all these needs which are popping up. And the interesting thing was as people came to us to study, they articulated what more they wanted. So we were extremely responsive. We kept reacting. So the plethora went on increasing, and covered the whole gamut of information system management at one level, down to doing entry-level programming. So it was languages, it was structured systems analysis and design, structured methodology, database design. All of the nuts and bolts issues in the 80s were important. And of course, we were trying to track the developments in the places where there was a thought leadership. So there was work happening in the US and MIT, work happening on the management of information at Oxford Institute of Management. And there were a few campuses which were doing path-breaking work. And we actually interacted with them. Then there were consultants who were doing thought-leading work. Edward Yordan, who's the father of software engineering, we made an arrangement with his company to teach structured methodology, and TCS was a very big participant, virtually all technical people. So I think it was trying to move very rapidly to come to the leading edge in all dimensions, not just programming, but all the way to information system strategy. And we had a very famous team of professors at Harvard Business School who had started a company which helped to build a 5-year, 7-year strategic plan for information technology. So we tried to expand to cover all constituencies. But quite clearly, the largest need was for people who could write the programs. I think that was a big need.
So that's quite interesting. I think then the pace really picked up because, I went to school in the 80s. I was in college in 90s, and the NIIT board was everywhere I looked, I remember. So can you speak about this NIIT network of institutes in the 1980s and 90s? And also, I guess, IT training really changed after the Y2K crisis because the amount of training required was tremendous. So if you probably can speak about that era.
So it changed after the Y2K opportunity first. Then it changed again after the Y2K crisis. So we'll come to that. But I think the 80s was a period when the programmer shortage was being felt even in the US quite a bit. So the whole thrust was very strong. We saw a very good response. We planned our operation quite well. You can imagine engineers at work. We used multimedia for the first time. Multimedia at that time meant color TV, the first of the color TVs, and the big U-matic video recorder and some recorded messages, and then our faculty. And we never use the word faculty. We call them coordinators. We never use the word teaching. We use the word learning, always. And we always looked at problem-based learning. We look at outcome-driven learning, the terms which are popular these days. From 1981, we had factored all of that. So we were very systematic in doing it. We were among the first ones in the world to get an ISO process for the learning process. So by 84, we realized that the demand is now becoming too large. We had opened offices in the metros. And then we knew that we had to expand our learning centers at a much faster rate. And that's the time we took a very careful decision to say that if you're going to spread into many more cities, we thought dozens, but it became hundreds and thousands towards the end. We realized that we'll have to change a business model because we didn't want hierarchy of managers running a service. Services have to be you have to be very close to your customer. So we created the idea of a franchise for education, which had been never done before. It was completely new. And there we found like-minded entrepreneurs. They were mostly young, bright people, well-educated families in small towns, living very well. And these youngsters are living in a Barsati in Delhi or a PG in Bombay. We motivated many of these people to go back and set up an NIIT center, an NIIT business, and very tightly defined in terms of requirements. If you walked into any NIIT center at the peak, thousands, it would give you the same look and feel. Same process, centralized training of faculty at locations in Delhi, Madras, Bombay, Bangalore, and everyone had to be certified. So there was a very intense rigor because we were now giving out our brand to our partners. The selection process of franchisees was somewhere for the first few years, I had to select, I and Vijay and Raju had to finally select each one of them, like every employee as well. So we had to build that network. That network actually became a very defining characteristic of our growth and of this sector. And in fact, I remember Far East Economic Review talked of it as the McDonald's of education. So, well, good and bad both. But I think the idea that we could spread and give consistency globally, that helped us to grow quite significantly.
So I think that's covered quite a lot of ground. So I'll just end with one final question. Most of the people who did computer education in the 1980s have had a rich and varied career by now. How do you see the legacy of that era in today's day and age? And actually, I'd like to divide this question into two parts. So one is the last 40 years, what has been the legacy? And more importantly, like the future, like the pandemic era has totally changed the way we have educated. So I'd like to hear your views on your idea of education in the future and what NIIT plans to do.
So maybe I should touch on the Y2K you made a mention.
Yeah.
So 90s was a golden decade. And if anyone did badly in the 90s, he would have been downright dumb. Anyone could do well. The world, and for the IT sector, there were a couple of things happening at the same time. India's liberalization had happened. We got the STP policy. We got a lot of support. India needed foreign exchange. We got a lot of push. But at the world stage, the Y2K opportunity was becoming large, and the world knew, the Western world knew that if they don't fix their problem by the year 2000, they'll have a catastrophe. So they were willing to spend a ton of money, right? And the internet had arrived. So it was a perfect storm in that sense. So 90s was a era where Y2K added fuel to what was already a high growth area for many factors. And then on that date, nothing happened. Everybody thought planes will fall, trains will crash, patients will die in hospitals. The people had drummed up that threat to a level it was unrealistic, but nothing happened. So actually there was a lot of disappointment in the people who had invested a lot, companies, individuals, on saying, I better get ready for Y2K. So there was a short period of great disappointment, the dot-com bust, and therefore at that time there was a shock. People felt that the bubble is burst. But as we know, again, a few years later, started growing. And then post Y2K, we were into new technologies. And it was becoming pervasive. And governments were beginning to invest. So I think, and then the PC had come, it was in the home, things were getting easier, and everybody was getting onto the internet. So that growth was a huge amount of tailwind that took us into that period as well. And took us then into the decade. So now we come perhaps to the legacy of this whole period, because there was a time when we were extremely in the face of every consumer in India. Everybody knew us, right? And we were 90% B2C, as we call it, and some amount of training for the ONGCs and Indian Oil, the top 20 companies. We were training the leaders and everybody else. But then over a period of time, as our international business grew, we found a very solid demand coming from corporations like we were doing in India. And today that is 80% of our business. 80% of what NIIT does is for the Fortune 100. You name the companies, okay, the top companies in all sectors, healthcare, airlines, engineering, oil. So for these companies, we do something called managed training services. So it's a service, it's like a learning process being outsourced. So for some of the very large corporations who have hundreds of training vendors, they give us the key and say, this is our budget, please manage all of this. It's a very distinctive and unique position. And that actually has kept us quite busy in the last many years to focus on a growth sector while the retail activity was shrinking somewhat. But then, as you know, we made a very important strategic choice in 2004 actually had decided to demerge the software business and focus on education. But it took us many years before we could do a proper exit. That happened in 2019, as you know. And all those funds are being used now to get into the next phase of growth for both our B2B, I don't want to call it B2B, but the company business, which is 85%, 88%, and the retail business, which is now beginning to grow very rapidly because we're investing now to rebuild the digital brand. And in many ways, the COVID has accelerated that, but I want to give a word of caution. I think people are wrongly thinking that online learning works. The fact is, it's a very, very mixed experience with very highly differentiated impacts. Very well-to-do people can learn. Those who have disadvantages are suffering. So the divide here is acute. Very highly motivated learners, self-learners, 5 to 7% of all learners can learn. They will learn even if you give them a book. A vast majority of those who need help, vast majority, they have not learned. And we are discovering that as we go forward. So there's a false sense of euphoria that learning can be done on technology completely. There is a very important role for it. And we've always, from day one, not day one, but in the 90s, we became very interested in computer-based training. Earlier also. We set up the first virtual university called NetVarsity in 1996. But we discovered that the internet was too slow. And then we have done a lot of initiatives. Now we have very powerful platforms and so on. So now we are rebuilding the talent marketplace. Because we don't do only IT, as you know, from 2006, we started doing banking training. We're one of the biggest there, tens of thousands of learners. Insurance, and then in these fields, sales training as well for those professions. And we see many sectors in which talent is required. So we have an expertise over these 40 years, which we think is unique, which is, we call them the core competencies. One of them is creating learning materials. I think we do better than most people. Second core competence is education process management. How do you manage the process of education? I think we've done that at scale in 40 countries. So these core competencies to be now applied to a blended model, which we believe in. And therefore, now we find that the India and such countries, developing countries, need to build talent in many sectors where IT is a big chunk of it in high growth sector, is really what we are revitalizing our whole method to go into this space and grow it very rapidly. So while the corporate business will keep growing at a very good rate, 20% plus, we expect that this part of the NIIT digital work will grow at a much faster. That's really where we are headed at this point in time.
Maybe just one final point. What do you think is the one big idea for the future of online education, computer education? I mean, whatever you call it, because we don't know what form it's going to take.
See, there isn't one, I have to say that.
Okay.
I mean, education is a very, very, very engaged, involved process where every learner learns in a unique way. We all know that.
Right.
Trying to put everything into a process has its downsides, number one. Number two, a human intervention is a must. People are discovering that. I think now as results come out of what happened during COVID, everybody did online learning, but now you're seeing the underbelly show up. And
right.
I had talked about it to people earlier also as well. That,
sure.
So online learning has a role to play, a very important role, but a very specific role. There are certain things it can do and certain things it cannot do. And therefore, a proper hybrid blended model is the solution. So the one thing is who get the blend right, if I can use that term. That's the magic. Who get the blend right? That'll make a difference between making an impact on people's lives or just kind of giving them a piece of paper.
So I think that's a good way to end. Who will get the blend right? Looking forward to the answer to this question. And also, it's been a very fascinating talk with you because it was from nothing. As you said, 70s, there was nothing. So it's been a very fascinating journey. And I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chinnan. Enjoyed the discussion. Thank you very much.